a substantial disconnect between the idea of one-stop shop and what one-stop shop actually was. A lot of what you described, Councilman Green, is what sold people on one stop. Oh, we're going to put everybody in the same room. They're going to communicate. This is all going to be great. It'll be more efficient. We'll need less people. And as someone who in the past has walked people through permits, when I used to do that kind of thing way back when I used to practice law, that efficiency never materialized. What you saw was that when you have fewer people, you have fewer people who are able to go do the work. The communication, just by jamming people on the same general area, didn't lead to greater communication. I think that we have never substantially as a city embraced the idea of basic customer service, in that the priority is actually getting the permit out, not in trying to find obstacles as to why permits shouldn't be done. Efficiency does not mean having less people to pay less salaries. Efficiency is, when do permits come in? How quickly are they reviewed? How thorough is the review? And when is there a final product that can be as many of you know, whether it's an acceptance or a denial? One of the most frustrating things I hear all the time, Frank, from people is, I wait 3.5 months and then get denied, when if it had told me the problem 1 month in, I could have fixed it. But now I've wasted all the money for 3 months, got denied, then sent back to fix a grease trap that I could have addressed 2 months ago, and also not spend additional money as if that grease trap, for example, was correct. So, I mean, fundamentally, one of the obstacles I've seen throughout the city, not just with permits, is there seems to be a lot of work being put forth to, at the end of the day, say, I can't help you, versus how do we collectively get to the end of whatever this journey is going to be. So I do appreciate, and I agree with you, more people is the answer, but also there has to be fundamentally a change of culture when it comes to department heads. I mean, as you saw previously, I know we've not had workforce commission, not while I've here, come forth on the kids not getting paid thing. But what really threw me for a loop was just say, okay, it's a problem, we're going to fix it, not have press conferences saying why you can't do it. And when it comes to permits and the permitting process, I am personally, and I know the district council people get this the most, when you have people frustrated in the permit process, you seldom get an email from a department saying, here's how we're going to resolve it. You get email saying, here's why it can't be resolved. And like I said, for many people, Frank, it could just be, no, you have to go back to the drawing board. Well, tell me that 1 weekend. Don't tell me that 4 months in, because all of that money and time and frustration, even with when you have neighborhoods working with a developer and they get to a compromise and then it still gets kicked back, then everyone's like, what happened to all this time and hours of my life I wasted trying to get this resolved, only to have a bureaucrat come in from left field and blow up the whole thing. So I think that I 100% agree. I think I've looked over, like I said, we just got this too. So I'm looking over, a lot of it is common sense, which apparently is not that common in the city of New Orleans. A lot of it's common sense. But also I think it's just, we really, as a council who are in charge of making sure these departments are funded, make sure they spend the money we give them. Make sure, I've said this to many departments, if salaries aren't appropriate, let us go with you to civil service to explain whether they're not appropriate. To your point, Tiger, you said out there, it's hard to say you should be a building inspector with the city of New Orleans when other people will pay you more for the same job. And if we have to go back and revisit salaries to make them competitive, rather than a department continue to advertise a job no one will apply for because it's below market rate, come back to the council, we'll go with you to civil service and go, we have to adjust these salaries. We hear that all the time. Many of the, Councilman Druso, all our budget means are us rechanging salaries because we force departments to work with us to say, we have to get to market rate because we can't expect someone to work at a discount just because it's New Orleans. I don't expect anyone to get paid less than what they're worth for the pleasure of being a New Orleans city employee. So we appreciate all your comments. This is probably just the beginning of working with you to resolve it, but the culture has to change towards how can we effectively help people both on both sides of the aisle get to a resolution, not continually have obstacles with no end.
And if I can add to your comments too, Councilman. Yeah, you guys have absorbed quite a bit of this in just a short time, but if you go through this whole document, you will find that a lot of your comments are addressed. And I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be the conclusion of all of you that the only way to go forward and help this city is to make some changes and help implement those changes properly. And it does include staffing. I also might want to make a point of that, in that the aging of the labor force, which is electricians, plumbers, mechanical guys, those guys might need a job after they retire. And there might be a way to implement that in the sense of doing these inspections and doing the things that need to be done with a qualified individual, rather than letting them go to waste and just have their license in their hand and doing nothing.
Mr. Adler?
Amazing that Councilman Morell read this report and absorbed all of that in that time. Did you really, or those are you?
I read quite a bit. I mean, it's nice bite-sized pieces.
At two levels here, what to do. Second level is how to do it. I think everybody is going to be pleased, as you pointed out, with the things that you've read here, that this is a good working document. Now, how can we help get it implemented? We don't know, but through Zach's expertise and experience, we're aware of what could happen with these suggestions. I think you'll be pleased with the suggestions. The price was right. And anything we can do to help you get them implemented, we want to do.
Thank you. Any other council comments? We have an online comment.
This comment is from Jeffrey Grannon. He says, recently my permit was delayed for over a year simply because the entire zoning department was unaware of the fact that an IZD expires after 1 year unless extended by ordinance. Despite numerous attempts to explain it to the zoning department, including department heads, I was ignored. When I did finally get responses, they said I was wrong and that even the legal department concurred that my property was subject to an IZD that had in fact already expired at the time I filed my permit. Instead of admitting that they were wrong, they shifted and claimed my application was incomplete, which I appealed to the Board of Building Standards and won. Finally, after a year and a half, they admitted that they were in fact wrong. By this time, the damage was done. The zoning department's mistake increased the cost of my project by over $250,000 due to inflation and increased interest rates. The staff of safety and permits are charged with making crucial decisions that affect people in real life. They make decisions that affect the development of the city, including affordable housing, business development, and many others. It all starts with safety and permits, and it's clear that from my experience, many are sorely lacking in knowledge to effectively do their jobs. Mistakes like the one that happened to me will continue unless something's done. One solution that could help with this problem is to make it a yearly requirement that department heads and staff be required to complete continuing education requirements, as so many other crucial professions are required to do so. Also, there has to be some notification system when ordinances like IZDs expire or are created, because the staff can't be trusted to be up to date on these things, as I have experienced. When the department heads are unaware of the current existing laws that affect permits, then you have problems, and it's the citizens of the city that will suffer. That's it for the online comments.
Thank you. If there are no other comments, that concludes. Any other comments from the audience? Mr. Smith?
If I may take one more minute. I really appreciate the comments of Councilman Green and Mr. Morell. You know, an interesting point, and I think Ms. Del Sol started to talk about it. But you know, the nice shiny office, which I believe I've always been a permit person. I'll always be a permit person. My heart will always stay there. I'm very happy for the staff of the permitting office. They got a nice office. Unfortunately, by sending only half of the one stop across the street, we now have half stop north here in City Hall, and we have half stop south across Poydras at 1340. I think fundamentally splitting up physically some of these agencies that have grown accustomed to each other is going to be detrimental to communication. the ability of a planner to go ask the zoning administrator a question by walking across a hallway is now gone. I know it's only gonna make things worse, so, and then having split offices or somebody on staff to man a desk on a rotation, it just doesn't work the same way. So a real investment in the one stop and making it a one stop is important. To Councilman Morel, I think culture is something that we talk about here. We talk about specifically a person as like a permit concierge to help the little guy out, to be able to help frontline some of those questions. And I think it would be beneficial if the 7 of you would publicly talk to the staffs of these agencies sometimes. A lot of times staff are glued to these hearings, these meetings. They hang on to words and coded messages or what they feel is coded messages. And I'm gonna say it out loud because we're here asked by you guys to come work at this. We weren't asked by the administration. I think the administration has a lot to do. I think the administration could do a lot more to support the staff by just saying out loud what we expect you to do. And, you know, it's been probably 4 years since I've heard the term City of Yes. It'd be nice to kind of hear it. You guys have a really good track record now of taking charge of things that other people won't jump into. So I'd encourage and ask that y'all, you know, really voice your opinions of support for the staffs of these agencies and tell them that you're here with them. You expect more from them, but also be clear on what you're asking. Because, you know, sometimes, and I'm going to pick on like the IZD, it's number 8 on my list. You know, it's sometimes the words around IZDs, the 7 of you sometimes pick on the departments for not enforcing or not doing enough of the job you want. And so sometimes people can hear it both ways. And I know, look, IZDs are there for a reason. They're important. They should be used sparingly, but making sure that you guys are aware of sometimes how y'all talk, because in the absence of the other side of the second floor not talking at all, you guys sometimes are the only adults in the room, and the employees, they relish hearing what they can do and getting direction and feedback. So I would encourage and challenge giving that direction and letting them know that, hey, yeses are what we want while not sacrificing enforcement, or exactly what that tone is. Let it start from y'all, because it's certainly not coming from the other side of the hall.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. All right, that concludes our presentation for item number 5.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll go to number 6 and do the.
Is everyone here?
Okay, correction. We're gonna go number 3. Resolution. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Resolution R 23-376.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This next resolution, and I'll have actually the Health Department come up. Ms. Pinkerton, actually, Dr. Graves, if you want to come up too with the Family Justice Center. So this next resolution that we have is actually one that deals with public safety and really an issue that is impacting our community at much higher levels now these days. And what we're talking about is domestic violence. And so this council is very much about looking for solutions as to how we can bring down the levels of domestic violence in our community, but also how we can protect the victims who are dealing with the most severe cases of domestic violence. So what the resolution does is it asks that for the most severe cases, those that deal with strangulation and those that are aggravated cases where a firearm is the weapon, that we are asking the court to have in all these cases what is called a Gwen's Law hearing. And those hearings are contradictory hearings where the offender is actually held until that contradictory hearing happens. And then bail is determined. And what the judge is really trying to assess is ultimately the lethality of this whole situation. How dangerous is this situation? In Jefferson Parish, they have roughly 150 Gwen's Law hearings every single month. They have them for the majority of their domestic violence cases. What we're asking for here is for the most severe cases to have Gwen's Law hearings. And I want to also say that I want the court and the DA's office, and I've had conversations with both, to look at this as really as a partnership with the council as to what resources do they need to be able to accomplish this very important goal to get this done. Because at the end of the day, I think that this would be a life-saving measure. And to explain why the data actually shows that, I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn Pinkerton with the Health Department for what our health department has shown, and then Dr. Grays with the Family Justice Center.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Grays, if you'd like to talk about Gwen's Law hearings or strangulation or domestic violence cases with a firearm and how dangerous those are, you can go ahead and start. We'll wait for your presentation to load up.
Okay.
Sure.
So first of all, I just like to say that I support this resolution. I'd like to thank you, Councilmember Moreno, and the rest of the city council for authoring this resolution. As we know, non-fatal strangulation is one of the most severe crimes of domestic violence. It causes internal trauma such as damage to the brain and the nerve system. So this resolution is needed because it will definitely give a voice to the survivors, which is very important, and their voice hopefully will make a difference as it relates to the bail bond hearings. And hopefully that will decrease the likelihood of perpetrators being able to repeat the crime. In our Hope Clinic, we've seen a lot of survivors come who have been, strangled, and it's very traumatic for them. And it causes problems down the line. Years later, they have severe damage that they're now just realizing is due to the strangulation that happened in the past. So hopefully these hearings will definitely make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Grays. And I think the most alarming statistic and why it's so important to really review these cases is that domestic violence victims who experience non-fatal strangulation by their partner are 750% more likely to be murdered by that same person.
That is correct. That's true.
Yep. And then the other piece too about why the firearm piece is so important is that a domestic violence victim is 5 times more likely to be murdered when the offender has access to a firearm. And so that's why this resolution really focuses on those two serious instances. One where there's strangulation, because the likelihood that this particular victim may be murdered down the road is high. And number 2, when there's a firearm present, it increases the lethality as well. So thank you, Dr. Grace. We'll just wait for the presentation. Is it not going to load? Well, the good thing is this, is that the presentation is on the agenda already. So it's already, so anyone online, if you are watching, you can actually go to the agenda and you can click on the presentation. Jocelyn, we all have copies. So why don't you go ahead and we can flip through the presentation as you talk, because I don't know if it's going to get loaded today. Fingers crossed. Jocelyn, you can come up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grace.
Councilmember Moreno,
Yes,
I have a question that may be able to be answered now, but
sure.
not. I actually thought that a representative of the district attorney's office was going to be present. So I just want to ask, and maybe it's something that, because you've been in communications with them, why are there so many more Gwen's Law hearings in Jefferson Parish versus right over the parish line?
Well, that's a question for them,
attorney, sorry.
but it's also a question for the judges as well, because often the judges don't want to grant the motions for a Gwen's Law hearing.
Because,
I think that
and I'm
there's
sorry, wait,
there's
you're right.
well, there's a
I have to
variety of
judge
different
this
reasons,
number.
but I can tell you that it can be everything from maybe they don't believe that there's enough information or witness testimony for a Gwen's Law hearing. And I can tell you, Councilmember Green, that there are some judges, and I'm not saying that they're just here in Orleans, but across the state, who just overall do not believe in having these types of contradictory hearings. They just absolutely don't believe in having them. And Councilmember Morel and I, who actually led part of this legislation when we were in the legislature, saw that. They just did not think that they were necessary nor warranted, nor did they really even take domestic violence seriously. So it kind of, a lot of those things kind of intertwine. I do want to say we did invite the district attorney's office to attend. They had conflicts and couldn't make it. And as far as the judges, I believe that Judge Davalier was going to try to attend. Obviously, she was not able to make it.
It's a complex matter, but a lot of the general public feels that in other parishes that surround us, that the issue of criminal justice is dealt with in different manners, which is why they have lower rates of certain types of violence. And I will reserve my questions because I thought that there were going to be representatives here, but I just appreciate this and just want to emphasize that we must be as serious about violence against citizens and the protection of victims here as in other places. And no matter what it takes, including the same that we just discussed, if it takes more resources or something, it needs to be taken seriously. We should not get into a position where there are 150 hearings in Jefferson Parish and such low numbers here without sufficient explanation. But I will ask that question of the judges and the district attorney.
Yes, I threw stuff down there, but. Thank you, Councilmember Green. Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you. Just though I had some comments, but also I'll address Councilman Green's. As I recall, when Councilmember Moreno and I were passing this law, the bulk of the opposition came from judges and then after them DAs, as far as a lot of challenges regarding how much work this would put on the judicial system to hold these additional mandatory hearings. And it took quite a bit of work on behalf of ourselves and advocates to educate judges across the state that these hearings are so crucial, because when you're dealing with people who are involved in domestic violence incidents, a lot of what Gwen's Law hearings, firearm dispossession, all these different steps, because of the nature of domestic violence incidents and how much rage, violence, anger, and emotion is involved, there are many instances in which simply having the Gwen's Law hearing and removing firearms from the household prevents both the victim from being a victim and also gives the perpetrator time to cool down, to not do the horrific, violent final act that you see across the state. We have asked the judges at that table repeatedly about the number of Gwen's Law hearings, and primarily the excuses we get why we shouldn't have them come from the judges. We have a whole spate of magistrate commissioners who should be hearing these hearings. We have one magistrate judge who's over them. We have a variety over them. I know Judge Lombard has said she will hold them, but there's no reason. New Orleans is unique in that we have separate criminal court and civil court judges. There's no reason why we shouldn't be having an issue, holding more hearings when we literally have specialized criminal court to just hear criminal hearings. There's no reason why we shouldn't be having 300 Gwen's Law hearings a month here, because the judges we have in New Orleans are purely dedicated to criminal practice, where in Jefferson, you're having judges who are in charge of criminal and civil matters hearing 150 hearings a month. That is a political will argument. And what's very frustrating is we, as in Councilman Moreno and I, had to fight the rest of the state to get gun dispossession and Gwen's Law hearings done. And the level of embarrassment I have as a former legislator, that other parishes that fought voraciously against this are now implementing it and reaping the benefit, while in this parish, continually, we have to fight to make Gwen's Law hearings be heard. It's embarrassing. I mean, I have colleagues across the state from when I was a legislator who told me the transformative effect of those domestic violence pieces of legislation we passed, how it's affected in a positive way outcomes, while in this parish, we fight constantly regarding NOPD gone on arrivals and domestic violence, downgrading domestic violence calls, having instances in which we have a strangulation and it gets downgraded to a attempted battery, where the officer en route is not told it was a domestic violence or strangulation. It's just on every step in this process, whether it be the police department, the DA's office, and finally the judges, almost every comment I had about departments and how they're not working together to have the best outcome applies to our criminal justice system. We are not victim centric. We are not, how do we protect victims from being killed, murdered, maimed, or somehow negatively impacted? Instead, all we hear at this table is, we're so sad, we're lacking this one thing or this one bit of money to make all this work. We have just as many resources, if not more resources, in our criminal justice system to have better outcomes in our surrounding parishes. It is a political will argument. The fact that every magistrate commissioner is not hearing Gwen's Law cases when they meet around the clock is embarrassing and asinine. It's just frustrating. Every magistrate commissioner can have a Gwen's Law hearing timely, more timely than Jefferson Parish, if that's what they wanted to do. Instead, it's, we can't. I'm so tired of hearing from criminal justice of the city with the amount of money we give them that we can't. It's exhausting. And I'm tired of victims telling us, here is our negative experience, and I get a but this, but that. The goal should be, if there's an instance of domestic violence in the city of New Orleans, every branch of law enforcement will take it seriously, and we should always err on the side of protecting domestic violence victims.
Mhm.
That's what Gwen's Law is about. You have the hearing, the cooling off period, to prevent the worst outcome. And the fact that we don't prioritize these hearings and have the worst outcomes, it's a direct correlation.
Yeah, and actually, I think we should go back, JP, and talk about why Gwen's Law was actually created and who Gwen was. It's written in the resolution. I wanted my staff to make sure that they put in her story. So Gwen Sally, she lived near the Shreveport area, and she had many difficulties with her estranged husband. His name was Michael Sally. And he ended up pointing a gun at her head and threatening her. This was back, I remember, in 2014, and he was arrested for threatening to kill her, and he was sent to jail, and he had a bail hearing, and he was given a high bail. Because we always hear these instances like, well, we're just going to give him a high bail and that's going to be enough. So he was given a high bail. It was $50,000, but he was still immediately able to bond out. So Michael Sally, as soon as he got out of jail, he went straight to his daughter's school, where he found Gwen and their 7-year-old daughter, just remembering a lot of this by memory, their 7-year-old daughter, and at gunpoint kidnapped them. In the car, Gwen was able to pretty much tell her little 7-year-old little girl to jump out of the car, which she did. And then Michael Sally drove he and Gwen to a remote location where he killed her, murdered her, and then killed himself. And so Gwen's family came to the legislature that year and said, if there could have just been some time, if there could have just been that cooling off period, just a few days, because he was in such a rage, and he did have the means to be able to bond out, even though he had a high bond. And so this whole argument that I keep hearing, we don't necessarily need Gwen's Law hearings. I'll just go ahead as a judge, just set a high bond, and everything's going to be fine. It's not, and that was the whole purpose of Gwen's Law, is to have those few days for there to be a cooling off period, but most importantly, so the victim could go someplace safe. So she or he could take themselves and their children someplace safe. So that's the importance of why we really need to push to have more of these hearings in New Orleans. And it's incredibly frustrating that 2 New Orleans legislators really led the charge on this initiative. And it's in Orleans where we're having such a struggle and getting these hearings done. And like I said, neighboring Jefferson Parish, they're actually doing the trainings around the state as to how to hold more Gwen's Law hearings, because like I said, they have 150 roughly every month, And what they do is actually every domestic violence case in Jefferson Parish is flagged as it's like a requirement that they're going to have a Gwen's Law hearing. The judge actually has to rule the opposite way, like taking it off of a Gwen's Law hearing list, because all the DV cases automatically are going to get a Gwen's Law hearing. And the jail is also notified that, oh, this is a DV offense. They're on the Gwen's Law list as well. So they may be held a day or two more because they're on this particular list. None of that's happening in our parish, but once again, there's a model out there, a model that we could follow, a model that's already being done in Jefferson that hopefully we can begin to replicate, starting with the most severe cases. With that, Jocelyn, I'll turn it over to you. And nice to see Dr. Avegno here as well, supporting her team. Okay, your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And it seems like it's not going to project on the screen, but as
We all have copies and it's on the agenda
Yeah.
for anyone viewing to be able to look at.
So my name is Jocelyn Pinkerton. I'm the director of our domestic violence and sexual assault program within the New Orleans City Health Department. Thank you so much for bringing this issue to the attention of the council today. We do a lot in our program, but I just wanted to highlight that a lot of the work that we do is coordinating various working groups and task forces and programs in order to improve our city's responses to domestic violence. So we have our mayor's domestic violence working group. We have a fatality review team that we just started last year. We'll be issuing an initial report shortly on that. We've been working on our firearms transfer task force to implement state legislation on firearms transfers. We also have a domestic violence multidisciplinary team that reviews high risk and high needs cases. And then our advocacy initiated response program that launched last year will also be issuing a report on our sort of first year pilot of that program shortly. And, you know, today I know we're highlighting some high risk domestic violence cases, particularly strangulation and firearms. I also wanted to add in repeat offenses as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do want to acknowledge that all of the criminal justice and community partners, like the Family Justice Center that work with us on all of these initiatives, these are all things that we're talking about that we really are trying to work together to improve our responses. But it is really helpful when the council amplifies this issue, because we think that it is, you know, really has a large effect on the safety of our community and the safety within our families. So that being said, like I mentioned, there are some lethality risk factors that are associated with an increased risk of homicides and violent relationships. And I wanted to highlight, you know, owning a gun is a risk factor, using a weapon against a victim or threatening with a lethal weapon, trying to choke or strangle a victim or cutting off breathing, and then also an increase in frequency and severity of violence and repeated law enforcement intervention. So I think it's important that we sort of focus on these high risk cases today. We wanted to look a little bit more in our program into repeat offenses. Studies have found that, you know, potentially a pretty significant number of people involved in a domestic violence homicide are known in the justice system prior to that homicide occurring, which means that we should be able to intervene with folks that are already, you know, have previously committed domestic violence crimes. So our office did a review of data from 2022. We reviewed a sample of 50 cases in which an individual was charged with more than one domestic offense within that year. And we found a couple interesting things. So over 40% of individuals with repeat DV charges still had open and active warrants at the time when we were doing this analysis. And I know that, you know, it makes sense to sort of prioritize potentially people that have open felony warrants for NOPD to prioritize going after those cases. But because we know that repeat offenses really amplify risk for domestic homicide, we've also been in conversation with NOPD about what it would look like to also prioritize repeat misdemeanor domestic violence open warrants. So that's a key piece here. Additionally, of the people that we reviewed in this sample, only 8 people were sentenced for domestic abuse, battery, or battery of a dating partner previously. So the way that our legal system, our laws are written, you have a first offense, a second offense, a third offense. Those incidents compound on each other. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Councilmember Moreno, that we need to make sure that we are utilizing those charges because it shows the escalation in the legal record. And then the sentences can be commensurate with the fact that someone has committed repeat offenses. And again, we know that those are really risky. So that's that was another one of our recommendations, is that we really need to be utilizing those enhancement charges when people are committing multiple crimes. I also want to say that this data review is posted on our website. So if anyone wants to take a deeper look at this, it's and the website will come up later, but on the New Orleans Health Department's website on the domestic violence and sexual assault page. Okay, so strangulation is another risk factor. As you mentioned, it's one of the most lethal forms of domestic and sexual violence. I just want to echo what Dr. Graves from the Family Justice Center said, was that people that experience strangulation might also experience long-term consequences. We think that people might not be aware of how serious the medical consequences are when breathing or blood flow is cut off to the brain. That can cause stroke later, psychological injury, traumatic brain injury. So not to mention the fact that, as you said earlier, that strangulation is definitely a risk factor for later homicide. We know that strangulation itself causes significant impacts for victims. So we did another review, also available for folks to look at on our website, where we tracked all of the strangulation incidents from last year in 2022. So there are almost 350 individuals that were charged with strangulation. And what we found in tracking these cases is that very few of those individuals were ultimately convicted of committing strangulation. And I'll sort of come back to this point a little bit later, but this is, I think, really representative of the fact that we really need to work together to make sure that when a strangulation incident happens, that our criminal justice system is following through in order to get conviction. So I think that's kind of our goal here, is to make sure that folks that are accused of strangulation, that we're doing all that we can in order to prevent that strangulation from escalating to a future homicide.
May I ask a question before we move on?
Sure.
And if you don't have the answer, it may be district attorney related, but based on your experience, why is that number so low?
Yeah.
3.3% is 10 or 12 people.
Yes, it's very low. So there's a lot more detail in the report that we issued, but I'll just say a couple factors off the bat. So first of all, I think if I remember correctly, it's around 40% of those individuals that are actually arrested. So a large percentage, the strangulation might have occurred, a warrant gets issued, and the individual never gets arrested. So that's a large proportion.
Well, but this is a 349 who were, oh, you're saying charged, but they never
Charged.
found them.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. So I think in this case, usually we see like around 50% of incidents actually result in arrest, but with strangulation, it's, yeah. Yeah.
Well,
And again, we have this report available on our website. I'm happy to send it to y'all, because I think it really.
That's a really interesting statistic too, because, we also see data from across the country. When you take a look at who the mass shooters are, things
Yes.
like that, it's individuals who have, the strangulation, it's DV strangulation like that in their past. So that makes it, these are actually very dangerous individuals, and I think that point needs to be really, pushed out there. And I mean, that's really actually pretty scary that they're only finding or arresting 40% of these individuals.
Yeah, agreed. And we found, interestingly enough, because a lot of incidents don't result in arrest necessarily, it might result in a warrant issued, but we found that the percentage of arrests are smaller for strangulation cases than when you put in all cases. I'm not sure why that is. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking at our report now. I was correct with those numbers. So that's a big proportion of it. I think we found around 40. So of the people that do get arrested, around 40% of those cases are refused. A lot of them were in progress when we did this, because these cases take a long time to adjudicate. And then there's other sort of reasons for outcomes. So the case, a very few percent were dismissed. Someone might have pled to other charges, which again is kind of an issue then with what I mentioned earlier with repeat offenses. If you plead to another charge that's not on your record, and then you can't, if it happens again, then they can't be pled with strangulation second offense. And then, a couple of other cases that we couldn't account for. So just to give you kind of an overview. And I know that and again, I'll touch on this a little bit more later. I think a lot of the reason why these cases are refused, from what we've heard from our partners at the district attorney's office, is because of a lack of victim engagement. Victims in domestic violence cases, as you all know, they're the victims, but a lot of times they're also the evidence. And so when victims don't want to participate in the case, that can, I know that, you know, our DA's office has said that that is a challenge for them. But I do think that, to your point, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit later, with Gwen's Law, that key is engaging victims in the process, also sort of connecting medical records with our criminal justice system.
And that's what I was gonna say. I mean, over at UNC, they have the best technology as far as being able to really prove those strangulation cases, because they have, I don't even know what like the technology is called, but it's able to like see deep bruising within the neck area. They showed me like a demonstration of it, which right there could be instrumental in trying to prove this case, even if the victim isn't available to participate on her own behalf. But with what you're saying though, Jocelyn, like can you almost blame victims for not participating at this point? I mean, if the person who strangled you, he hasn't even been arrested, and we all know that a person being arrested actually helps when it comes to victim participation. So if they're not even arrested, they're still out there. You know, it takes forever to first of all, it takes forever for your call to be responded to, right? So there's that. And then it's like, okay, so now finally police come out. Okay, so now it's like you're giving him information about what happened to you. And then it takes forever for this person to get arrested. And then it's like all these different things. I mean, and they're literally scared for their lives at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a good point, because there's a lot of reasons why victims might not want to participate in cases. But I think that as a system, we can do more to do all that we can to engage with victims and provide all the information and transparency about how the system works and facilitating that connection. So yeah. Okay, and then firearms. So since, oh, it looks like the presentation's up. So since 2012, Louisiana has ranked in the top 5 in the nation for female victims killed by male offenders and single victim, single offender homicides. We have a really high domestic violence homicide rate. And I believe a lot of that is driven by the proliferation of firearm ownership in our state. Our domestic abuse fatality review has found that from 2012 to 2020, approximately 2/3 of domestic homicides were rooted, domestic homicides that were rooted in intimate partner violence did involve a firearm. So firearm possession is another red flag where, you know, an incident could escalate to a homicide. So Councilmember Marino, I know you already sort of reviewed a little bit of what Gwen's Law is, and I just wanted to kind of be clear that Gwen's Law is at the initial hearing, a Gwen's Law hearing could be set for several days later, and so that defendant would be held without bond until that time. And then at the Gwen's Law hearing, the law does state that the judge or magistrate shall consider potentially requiring the defendant to wear an electronic monitoring device. And something that we've heard from our partners at the DA's office is that that has been a really helpful tool for a lot of victims. And so I think that's another interesting component of why Gwen's Law can be helpful. And then at that hearing, then bond shall be considered. I also want to say that you mentioned earlier too, that we've done a couple different previous sort of looks into correlations on strangulation cases between outcomes in cases and bond amounts. And what we found is that higher bonds don't necessarily lead to defendants in those cases spending more time in jail. And so I think that also is sort of evidence for why having this additional time period can be helpful, because we can't just rely on bond amounts to hold people incarcerated, just like in the case with that where Gwen's Law initiated from. So again, I just want to echo too that besides being sort of a quote cooling off period, for me, the most important piece about Gwen's Law is that it allows for additional time for survivors to gather support and develop a safety plan. So a safety plan is a set of actions that can help lower risk, sort of figuring out how to stay safe, how to reduce the risk of future harm. So it gives victims more time. When someone gets arrested, you know, they could be brought to jail, their hearing could be the next day, they could bond out a day later. And so that's really can be a very short amount of time that that defendant is removed from the home. I mentioned earlier that our advocacy initiated response program, we're going to be, we're issuing sort of a report on our first year of doing that program in the 3rd district. And I want to thank the council for allowing us to expand that program citywide. We're working with the New Orleans Family Justice Center to have community advocates follow up with victims and reporting persons after every domestic incident. And so right now, just so folks know, we're operating that in the 3rd and 4th districts, and we're working to expand into the rest of the city by the end of the year. So I just want to highlight a statistic that we found from our first year of operating in the 3rd district is that almost 80% of victims who we engaged with requested linkages to referrals. So what that tells me is that, so first of all, the numbers for this program were really exciting. We're really excited about this. We've been able, of all the people that we reach out to, we've been able to reach about 60%, which I think is pretty good for this type of program. And most of those folks, we are referring to additional resources. We know when police officers go out to the scene, they do their job as police officers, but they're not social workers, and they can't necessarily take that extra time, or nor do they have sort of the knowledge of sort of linking people with other resources that might help prevent further law enforcement intervention later in domestic incidences. So when our advocates are reaching out to people after NOPD shows up, they are referring people to the Family Justice Center, and the Family Justice Center provides case management and counseling and a whole lot of other support services for survivors. And so they might be referring people to the Family Justice Center to help safety plan after that incident. We're also giving a lot of folks civil legal assistance. So after a domestic incident, a survivor might need to go to civil court to file an emergency protection order that could cover emergency custody for their kids, and that takes time. So you need to, you know, go to the court during business hours, file the order, get in touch with a lawyer, etc. And so we're seeing civil legal services being a huge need, and then also behavioral health services. And we all know, I think that the process of navigating sort of the behavioral health system can be complicated, and it takes time to be connected with behavioral health services. So my point here is that we know that people need additional support, and what Gwen's Law can do is give survivors that additional time in order to follow up with a referral to the Family Justice Center, in order to go file a civil protection order, in order to seek out behavioral health services for a kid who's acting out because there's violence in the home. So we know that this extra time for survivors is something that is really needed. Okay, so we did just a little bit of digging. It looked like from January to June, from what we could tell, there were 49 motions filed to hold Gwen's Law hearings in magistrate court. And I just compared that with strangulation cases and cases that involved aggravated assault with a firearm. So there were 67 individuals arrested for strangulation within the last 6 months, and there were 12 individuals arrested for aggravated assault with a firearm.
So for those 49 motions, were those motions granted?
Great question. So we are looking into that. It is hard to tell based on, like, we have to search in Docket Master basically for that information. So I'm having an intern look at the court records for each of those 49 cases, but that takes time.
Yep. Okay.
I'd also like to know of the 67 individuals who were arrested at the end, what is the disposition? I mean,
Right.
for example, if we're gonna go they were arrested, they
Yeah.
were charged. That's not a police matter now. It's a matter of prosecution.
Yes.
If there's 3% of those who are, then that's gonna be 2 people who are convicted at the end of the day. And that's a message that's clear, and I think it's clear in our city. It's not, I'm not here to blame, but the percentage chance of you being found guilty as charged in our city is much too low. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, we need to address that. But if you have 67 individuals arrested for domestic strangulation, which is such a serious battery, I'd be curious, and I would ask you to maybe even follow up, or clearly I could follow up with the district attorney's office, but you all kind of do this. I'd like to find out what happened in the first 6 months with these 67 individuals.
Sure. Yeah, we can definitely report back on that. And again, sometimes these cases do take a while to
Yes,
go
they
through
do.
the adjudication process, but yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to highlight those numbers because, Councilmember Moreno, according to your motion, so we should see a lot more Gwen's Law hearings filed just for these cases involving strangulation and firearms. But we do have other cases that might be high risk that, would fall into other high risk categories, or where survivors might request Gwen's Law. So we will keep tracking these numbers, and like I mentioned, we can keep sort of looking more into more detail about the Gwen's Law motions that are filed, and we can report back. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about strangulation and firearms, and sort of, those groups that I mentioned at the beginning, a couple of things that we've discussed that would help improve responses and how Gwen's Law fits into that. As you mentioned earlier, domestic violence victims who experience non-fatal strangulation are more likely to be murdered by that same person. Our Mayor's Domestic Violence Working Group did convene a special meeting earlier this month, and our partners came up with sort of a bunch of different items that we want to work on together in order to improve responses for strangulation in particular. So one thing that came up is that our state statutes are a little bit limiting as far as the punishment that can be issued or sentence that can be issued when someone is convicted of strangulation, because a lot of times the maximums time is relatively low. What I do want to say though is that, and we've talked with our partners that it might be helpful to do some sort of statewide legislative advocacy around this. But what I do want to say is that I think it makes sense, even if some state laws are limiting for how much we can do in these cases, I think we need to use the laws that we have at our disposal. So Gwen's Law is a law that is a tool that we can be using. So we need to, advocate for improvements to state statutes, but also make sure that we're utilizing all of the legal tools that we have. As I mentioned earlier, victim engagement is a really big issue. And I think Gwen's Law can help with this because it can give us more time to reach out to victims, get them engaged with the criminal justice process. Like I mentioned, our advocacy initiated response program, our advocates are being able to reach kind of around 60% of victims. And we try at least 3 times over a couple, period of days to get in touch with people. I can't tell you how often someone's phone is broken in a domestic incident. And so it can be difficult to get in touch with folks. I understand that. But I think that giving our legal system a little bit more time and giving that cooling off period for offenders and sort of extra safety planning time for victims is also really helpful for us to make sure that we're getting in touch with them and engaging them. You mentioned earlier as well, the medical and criminal legal coordination. That's something that we're working on getting, like you said, we have all this, this wonderful forensic program at UMC, getting those folks together with EMS and the DA's office, making sure that we have sort of streamlined ways for that evidence sharing. And the other thing about victim engagement is that if we're engaging with victims early, we can talk to them about the importance of seeking medical care, not only for themselves, because we know how serious these incidents are, but also to gather evidence, which is, as I said, victims in domestic cases are victims, but they're also evidence. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and I think when you mentioned, wanting to know what the outcomes were of those 49 hearings, our case management systems and tech need improvements. It's hard for us to look into this data based on how we have to sort of comb through court records in order to do that. And we talked as a group too that, like you mentioned in Jefferson Parish, sort of the domestic cases are flagged. It would be really helpful for us to have more flagging systems within our justice tech overhaul, being able to flag somebody who's prohibited from possessing a firearm, being able to flag high risk domestic violence cases.
And as you know, Lafourche Parish, they
Yes.
flag the prohibited possessors of a firearm. And so that law enforcement knows if like that address where this particular person may live, that they know that, to watch out for that.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't have that here. And so that's something that we've been in communication with the Office of Criminal Justice Coordination about, but looking forward to that tech overhaul. The other thing that I know our partners have talked about is just sort of a lack of public awareness about the health risks risks of strangulation. And so that's something that we're also working on. I think people, a lot of times survivors and victims, minimize injuries that happen to them for a variety of reasons. But we do really want to get the message out that if your breathing or circulation was cut off, that has some really significant health consequences. And we really want to encourage people to seek medical care as soon as possible.
Before you go to the next piece, I want to kind of harp on what the council vice president just said. Docket master is basically DOS. I mean, I used to be a public defender, and the same exact docket master that was there when I was there is the one that's still there, where basically, for those of you who haven't had the wonder of using docket master, you basically go on the search engine and you type in very specific information. Hopefully the name is spelled correctly in docket master, the name, first initial, last, the race, maybe age, and it gives you kind of a general search. The challenge, and it's a technological challenge, which has existed since the beginning of time. I'm so very surprised, and with the ridiculous amount of money we wasted on Hexagon, this wasn't resolved. But even if you had the right steps followed, where you flagged and had all these things done in docket master to say a person had a strangulation case, they're flagged for disposition of a firearm, unless docket master is communicating, which it doesn't, with all the various search engines in the police car, you would need someone to go manually put in like NCIC or somewhere else that this flag occurs. And it's jarring that other parishes are light years ahead when it comes to technology. To your point, like, I mean, I do feel your pain in that you literally have to task someone to search through docket master to see dispositions, because the disposition is only in docket master as far as like, this was the finding, this was the reset. And there isn't a dashboard where you can go to and track each section of court to see what happened. And it has been a constant source of frustration to this council and the public that there seems to be not an effort when it comes from criminal court to make it easier to track cases. Because docket master, I mean, when you look at what happened with the coroner's office with misspelling a name and not being able to find a victim and reunite them with their parents, that's pretty much every day in criminal court with docket master. If you misspell someone's name in docket master, even if that person has significant pending charges, if their name is misspelled based on docket master and their driver's license, it creates chaos. So I guess my general point is, I'm sorry you still have to use docket master. When I was there, it was absolutely awful. And the fact that it's still there, God, 20 years later, tells you that this is significantly a problem.
Yeah, I think it was docket master. That's actually they've been using the same system for longer than I've been alive, and I'm definitely older.
Probably not. I mean, docket master, for those of you who don't remember, like from War Games with Matthew Broderick, where it's the green screen, you type things in, that's docket master. Docket master is literally a throwback to the 80s.
Yeah. And so I think to your point, having these systems communicate with each other is extremely important. Just to give you all an example, when our police department, they can't necessarily, there's no easy way for them to see if someone has been convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor, in part because those cases have moved back and forth from criminal court and municipal court, which is, it is what it is. But I think the larger issue is that there's no sort of like, one database or one place where we can see those previous convictions. And as I mentioned, repeat offenses need to be sort of are higher risk, and so need to be sort of flagged so that we know that someone has been previously convicted. This also leads me into discussing firearms transfers. So a domestic violence victim is 5 times more likely to be murdered when the offender has access to a firearm. Firearms are also the leading cause of death for kids across the country and also in Louisiana. I just want to say that at the health department, we have been working on firearm safety campaign, encouraging folks to keep firearms securely stored away from kids. This is definitely a big issue that we feel very passionate about. And same things with domestic violence, as I mentioned earlier. A significant portion of our domestic violence homicides are committed with firearms. And so I was just talking to a survivor the other day, actually, who said that she felt a lot more comfortable after she purchased a gun to protect herself. And I understand that that was helpful for her in that situation, but I just want to also remind everybody that when a gun is involved, it doesn't matter who purchased it. If somebody in the home has access to that firearm, it ups the lethality significantly for homicide. So our domestic violence firearms transfer task force has been working since 2018 to strengthen the transfer process. So I just want to reiterate that folks that are subject to domestic violence protection orders, whether they originated out of civil court or criminal court, are prohibited from possessing firearms for the duration of that order. Someone who is convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor is also prohibited from possessing a firearm for 10 years after that conviction. We've been working really hard on this and we have made some progress, but it is slow going. I do want to say that the sheriff's office did facilitate the transfer of firearms from 22 prohibited possessors last year. It's a struggle, I think, to a major part of the firearms transfer is that defendants, it's sort of on defendants in order to initiate complying with the law and transferring firearms away from the possession. We have talked with national experts on this. I've definitely been in touch with a lot of folks on the national level that have been helping communities implement these laws. And something that they've said is that Gwen's Law could actually be really helpful for increasing firearms transfers because it gives the defendant extra time to sort of think about the importance of making sure that they are complying with the law. Because if they don't transfer their firearms to the sheriff's office and any, incident happens, they can be arrested for that. So we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to be in compliance and not possess firearms when they're prohibited from possessing them, because that's would be an additional criminal charge. And so I know that we are working really closely with criminal court and the sheriff's office in order to tighten up this transfer process. We will continue to do everything we can to do that, but we definitely appreciate any assistance from the council and any sort of recommendations for improving this, because we know how deadly firearms can be when they're in the home that involves violence, or unlocked firearms when they're in the home with kids. So I think that's it. So our website is listed there. A bunch of our reports can be found online. Hope Levins is on vacation today, much deserved, but she did a lot of the work on this as well. So just want to give her some credit. Happy to answer any further questions.
Well, thank you to you and Hope, Dr. Avegno, and the whole team at the health department for your work on trying to prevent domestic violence and trying to assist victims and really coming up with really amazing policy ideas based on best practices to deal with this significant issue in our community. Very much appreciate your work. Any comments from the dais? Seeing none. Anita, we do have a comment from the district attorney. If you can read his statement, please.
Yes, this is a statement regarding resolution R23-376. Excuse me. Gwen's Law is a helpful tool in serious cases under which prosecutors may request and the court may order a contradictory hearing prior to setting bail for a person charged with domestic abuse, battery, and related crimes. The purpose of this hearing is for the court to carefully consider the dangerousness of the defendant, what conditions of bail are most appropriate, and whether the potential threat is so great that it warrants holding the defendant without bail pending trial. During a Gwen's Law hearing, the court must consider factors such as the seriousness of offense, weight of the evidence, ability to pay, defendant's criminal history, the potential danger the defendant poses to the victim's family, and any member of the public, especially children, and documented history of defendant's substance abuse or use of force or threats against any victim. Domestic abuse, battery, strangulation, and aggravated domestic abuse battery involving a firearm are two of the most serious and lethal forms of domestic violence, and the exact type of cases for which Gwen's Law hearings are most frequently requested. Accordingly, the Orleans Parish DA's office firmly supports a general policy of requesting Gwen's hearings in these cases, with few exceptions. The recommendation aligns with what our ADAs are presently doing in court. We also suggest a slight amendment to make clear that this should apply not only to domestic battery with a firearm, but also aggravated assault with a firearm. An individualized determination may still be needed where, for example, a defendant is arrested on a years-old warrant or the facts of the evidence fail to support arrest charges. However, absent an ethical or constitutional obligation to deviate, the Orleans DA's office agrees that a policy of requesting Gwen's hearings in these cases could serve to protect domestic and dating violence victims, their families, and the public. Prosecutors may also request Gwen's hearings where there is an escalating pattern of violence, domestic battery committed by burning or against a pregnant victim, or other egregious allegations. Domestic violence cases are heartbreaking and alarming, particularly given the frequent presence of children who we know suffer lifelong developmental impacts from even hearing violence. They are also extremely challenging. The DA's office welcomes further conversation with the City Council and the CAO's office on the resources and obstacles involved in pursuing these hearings and how we can work collectively to increase victim protections and hold offenders accountable.
Thank you, Anita. Any other public comment? No. Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for your presentation. I may have a couple amendments to this resolution, so that's why I'm not going to ask for any type of vote today. And I'll just handle it during our next full council meeting. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, moving along, we're gonna jump to item number six. We're gonna discussion regarding mobile push cart food vending in the city, specifically in the French Quarter. We're gonna have a presentation, just want to get a conversation started to let the public know that this council, specifically myself, is dedicated to giving everyone an equal shot and an equal opportunity to be a part of, to have that American dream and to own a business and operate in the city, specifically in the French Quarter. There is some legal background to this. It's a case that started in the 70s, New Orleans v. Dukes versus Dukes, that pretty much outlined that whether the question was the grandfather provision unfair against the rules of equal treatment in the Constitution? So some background about the New Orleans v. Dukes case. New Orleans had a famous, this is a brief by my chief of staff, so bear with me. New Orleans has a famous area called the Vieux Carré, or the French Quarter. City passed a rule saying push cart sellers can't operate there. But if a push cart seller had been doing so for over 8 years, they may continue to operate in the French Quarter. This is called the grandfather provision. A food seller who had been in the French Quarter for only 2 years didn't really approve of this rule, and she sued the city. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court said that the grandfather provision is okay. It says that the city can make rules about local businesses, especially if it's about making a tourist place like the French Quarter attractive. New Orleans could decide to only stop newer push cart sellers and not the older ones. And that rule has been in place since the 70s. And since the 70s, there's only been one company doing mobile vending in the French Quarter. And we've been getting a lot of concerns and questions from small businesses that would like to operate in the French Quarter. So we are opening this conversation up today to get some feedback from colleagues, as well as stakeholders in the French Quarter, as well as those small businesses, to get their input and to move the conversation forward to see how this council will address this decision that's nearly 50 years old. So with that, I would take any comments or questions from the dais. Councilman Green.
It's a challenging issue in terms of, something. Let me wait until the public comments. You have cards?
I have one card. I see.
I'll wait and then I'll comment.
You have a card? Want to say anything? No, I saw you in the audience. Okay. Okay, so we do have a card from Miss Erin Holmes representing VC Pora.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Erin Holmes. I'm the executive director of VC Pora in the French Quarter. We've actually had a couple of preliminary meetings with Councilmember King on this, and I want to say thank you for bringing this up for a discussion rather than, starting with a legislative instrument. This is the best way to go about tackling head on what can be kind of a complicated issue. And so we do want to express interest in working with you to get this right. Of course, we want to support emerging entrepreneurs, especially in the French Quarter. It is definitely a more difficult business climate to get into because of the price of rents, et cetera. And there's additional layers of regulation there for good reason. Our major issue right now, I think in the past couple of months, has been illegal vending. It's very much a wild, wild west situation out there. A lot of it is not related to food at all. Let me be clear. There's a lot of illegal vending that is just plain illegal and dangerous. But I do want to thank the various offices and departments that have collaborated in a few sweeps to set a tone that enforcement can and will happen. But that leads us to the next step, which is how can we provide more opportunities? In regards to public vending, and as we would move forward, a lot of guardrails would need to be put in place to protect the public health and safety from open flames, obviously, and to food safety. We also would need to consider and mitigate impacts on accessibility, potential overcrowding, and sanitation problems. I think that future mobile vending operators need a very specific and detailed operational allowances, including the locations that are allowed. We want to make sure that these are concentrated in reasonably in areas that they're going to receive the most business. And so these are in the heavily touristed areas of the entertainment and commercial districts and not in the residential areas. Operational hours and distance requirements. We have spacing requirements with tour operations, and I think that those can also be considered when you're considering any type of legislation that would allow for mobile vending permits. I also think that just talking about mobile vending in the French Quarter, we're missing some opportunities to look at other creative options to support small businesses and small operations. The pop-up ordinance, which was passed, I believe, about a year ago, I think is a really creative way that can be utilized in collaboration with local businesses to create spaces for new vendors to come on in a healthy way and a healthy and safe way. And then we also need to look at the redevelopment of the wharves on the riverfront by Audubon as creating spaces for new food vendors and types of small businesses like that. So again, we look forward to working with this council and specifically Councilmember King on any legislation that might come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Holmes. Just to answer some of the questions you or others may have, we do realize that illegal vending is a huge issue. I'm sure not only for the larger businesses in the French Quarter, larger restaurants, but for the smaller restaurants, smaller push cart vendors who would like to get in the French Quarter. They don't want to compete with somebody selling the same item with no overhead, not paying any taxes, not paying anything, not paying any fees. So we want to make sure we get the illegal vending under control before while we allow more push cart vendors in the French Quarter. Right now, there is one vendor, Lucky Dog, who is in the French Quarter. They don't have any open flames, so open flames in the future would not be something that would even be considered. The French Quarter is just everything is too compact and too dense to allow open flames. I believe you're right. Having a place where that's out of the residential area and more of the Jackson Square towards Canal Street area would be more ideal, so that the residents, because the French Quarter is a residential neighborhood, as well as a commercial neighborhood, a commercial area, your residential area should not have push carts. And the number of push carts, I think, is something that we need to really look at and figure out how we make this palatable for everyone. Right now, there are 22 permits or 22 allowed push carts. I know there's some concern about adding the number of push carts while we add the number of those individuals who will be allowed to vend in the French Quarter. So there are a couple of things we're going to work out and discuss and talk through, not all today, but my goal is to make this happen. I want to make this happen. I believe this council is shown that it is a council about diversity and about giving everyone an equal opportunity and taking on those challenges or those laws or ordinances that weren't addressed in the past. So with that being said, I'm going to go to the next comment card from Mr. Butler, Miss Butler. Miss Butler, come on up to the mic.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Josina Butler, and I'm a small business owner, entrepreneur. I'm originally born here in New Orleans, was living in Philadelphia, decided to move back down after my son graduated high school, come back to my roots. And up in Philadelphia, I was selling an Italian water ice, and I decided to open up my business here in New Orleans. And I went through the proper channels in regards to coming down here to the one stop, getting my permitting and license, have the LLC registered with the state of Louisiana Health Department, only to go through a lot of obstacles and barriers. I have an ice cream cart, which requires dry ice, and I sell prepackaged ice cream. And it appears that as I was going through the process, they explained to me that I had to go under the food truck avenue, which I don't require any electricity. I don't require any fire or extinguishers or anything like that. But they pretty much explained to me that they're not familiar with it. So I just had to fall in line with the food truck. But I just want to be able to generate an income and be able to participate in creating income for others and also paying my taxes. I did everything the legal way, only to be denied and restricted from other places where I can create and generate this income. But I'm here, I'm new to the process of learning how it operates here in New Orleans, but it's just seemed that it's not designed for everybody to go ahead and be a part of the process. I want to eventually move up into the brick and mortar and expand everything like that, but I'm only starting out with a push cart selling ice cream, which some people love on these hot summer days here in New Orleans. So I just hope that we can just have open communications and look for better avenues for everybody to, get in on, creating wealth for their families. And also, I would like to give a special shout out to Mr. Helena Morano. My daughter came to your girls program at the end of July. Thank you.
Ms. Butler, before you go,
Yes.
I find that very interesting, only because it's my understanding there is a similar set aside of push cart permits for ice cream carts that are held by a single person. So this came to my attention last week. My office is starting to look into it, but I think that if somebody told you the only avenue was to get a food truck a permit, I think that might, I'm going to verify that this information is correct, but I believe there is a single owner of a similar number of permits as Lucky Dog regarding ice cream carts. They just choose not to put any ice cream carts out currently, which is actually more frustrating than what's going on with Lucky Dog, in that if somebody is sitting on all these permits and there are people like you who are willing to go do it immediately, that's actually worse, because someone's just sitting on permits that could be generating revenue for you and for the city. if it were released. So my office was made aware of that this weekend. We're to get more details on, but we'll reach back out to you, because if that's the case, if permits aren't being used, they need to be put back out in commerce. You can't just, these are not taxi cab CPNCs where you can sit on them forever. Either use them or lose them. So we're gonna look at that for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Dreyer? Bill Dreyer?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman. I don't have a lot to say, and I'm sorry I'm not dressed better. I woke up about 5 minutes before this started. I didn't have plans to be able to be available. But one thing I hope that you guys do keep in mind is the issue of economic mobility and class mobility specifically. Starting a business at this size means that it's easy to scale. It allows business owners to make good decisions, and does end up putting them in brick and mortar situations, which I think we all agree helps the city. I think the way this started was kind of a difference between the haves and the have-nots. A little bit of a power move, and I know there's a gentleman here that's looked far back into this. So just one thing I hope you guys do consider is that the economic mobility of a lot of people does depend on this, and just focusing on this one issue does open up opportunity for thousands of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Jimmy Robb?
Good afternoon, council. I'm Jimmy Robb. Was born and raised in New Orleans. I'm a homeowner in District B. And I did everything I was supposed to do to start my push cart business, which is Glizzy's by Papa. For the last 2 years, I have won the best hot dog in New Orleans. And back in May, we was at Starlings Park when they put the new court down.
Basketball
You
court.
tried the hot dogs, and you know what they is. But I'm here to say that the quarters is like the most lucrative parts of the city, and where that people like me and myself want to chase out the American dream. And like you said earlier, when I was listening to you said about y'all was fighting for the Gwin law, and now that is implemented, that judges don't enforce it. And I think it's because like this lucky dog power play, that once people get in certain positions, they get complacent and they're not ready for change. And I feel like that it's time for change, or even give some competition for Lucky Dog to keep them honest in the French quarters about the product that they sell. So once again, I'm Jimmy Robb, and I'm here in support of getting us local people in the quarters, you know, to try to pursue the American dream.
Well, and Mr. Robbins, I'm hopping in, Mr. Chairman, I hope you don't.
No.
It's interesting because, as you may have noticed, there aren't any carts in the CBD at all.
Right.
And that is actually because, and this predates me, obviously, but there was a huge fight with Dorothy May Taylor over having more inclusion in carts and availability. And because of that, the Lucky Dog and other cart vendors, the ice cream vendors of the mystery ice cream cart vendors, were restrained to the quarter, and the CBD and the CBD and the Superdome were held back. And I think that two things need to be revisited. Obviously, we need some parity in the French Quarter, but there's a tremendous opportunity, especially because of our two sports teams and that traffic, where that's an untapped market.
Right.
Which we also need to relook at and reopen, because there's no reason why you couldn't have Glizzy's by Papa in front of Saints games,
Right.
Sugar Bowl, concerts. That's
City
a
Hall,
whole
every day.
City Hall. There's a whole untapped market,
Right.
which was specifically held off of by council member Taylor, because she said there wasn't enough parity in the French Quarter. So this area needs to not be expanded into until parity is addressed. So obviously, we're going to work with Council Member King on the French Quarter, but as we're doing that, let's not revisit the CBD warehouse district, because as you know, with game day and every concert, that's a whole untapped market that y'all should have access to as well.
Right, also, but the parameters is from Partridge to, I believe, North Rampart, no, Partridge to Esplanade and Rampart to the river. So it's those blocks out there that we are not allowed in.
Right, but what I'm saying is the reason why you don't see Lucky Dog carts in the CBD warehouse district is because of that Dorothy May Taylor fight.
Okay.
So like, even though it's allowed, they're not out there, it's because it was unresolved. So I think as we're resolving everything, we should resolve everything. We should try to expand and have, obviously, we have to deal with parity in the quarter as well. So I'm not saying we have to do that too. Madam, we have to deal with the ice cream carts, because the fact that there's somebody sitting on ice cream cart permits and we don't have carts on the quarter, that's foul. I mean, if you have somebody sitting on permits for ice cream carts, and I mean, this is the hottest summer on record, and you have people who are entrepreneurs who want to be in the quarter selling ice cream, why is someone allowed to sit on permits and not use them? That makes no sense.
And how long have they had them?
We're looking into that right now. I wasn't even aware there were ice cream car permits till Deep Throat called me and said, hey, did you know that there's some ice cream car permits that aren't being utilized at all? Like, I mean, it makes you wonder how long these little games have been played and how have we not caught on to them sooner. So I do agree that there needs to be parity in the corner on hot dogs and street vending, pursuant to what Aaron said and what Councilman King said, that obviously there's some constraints with how we use the carts, can't have open flames, the like, but ice cream carts should be in the quarter as well. We already have apparently a permitting process for it, and we need to expand the feasibility where you are allowed, because I don't know why we don't have more carts available in the CBD and around the Superdome where the demand is there, it's just not being utilized.
Right.
Thank you for coming today.
All right, thank you.
And just to clarify, it was said a few times, food truck, this won't be a food truck, it'll just be a push cart, again, with no open flames. But Mr. Lizzie, what's the, Rob, I'm sorry, Rob. I'm glad you came, because hearing from people like yourself, who are from this city, who are just trying to make an honest living, doing the right thing, be an entrepreneur, employ other people, take care of their family, homeowner. It's people like you that quite frankly look like you, that's the reason we're doing this. So I'm happy to take this charge. I'm happy to have the support of my colleagues and this council, like other things. We will take this challenge head on and do what's right for the people of the city, not just one particular group, but everyone in the city. So with that being said, we have Ms. Maddie Charles.
Just one quick thing. Chairman King, I think that just some information I think that would be useful for the whole council as we work toward this. And I know Councilmember Morale and yourself, and I'd like to be part of it as well, as we work toward a solution here. I'm curious as to know is how many different types of push cart permits there are. I mean, I obviously learned about the ice cream today, and then also looking at setting in timelines as to when that particular person who gets a permit has to utilize that permit. I mean, once again, that's really shocking that someone would just pick up all of the ice cream permits and just keep them. I mean, so no one else can get in there. I mean, and have a shot. And it's just like appalling that we just would allow that. So I think there needs to be some type of time limit set or something. But just a couple of points to put out there as we continue this discussion and find the solution to solve this problem overall.
So what I'm understanding, and this is not 100% correct, I don't mind being corrected. There are 22 food carts, all owned by one company, and there are 22 ice cream licenses or permits, all owned by one company. So that's a total of 44 licenses / push carts that can be on the street. I don't know if we need to have 44 at one time in one concentrated area in the quarter, but that's the answer to those.
Thank you.
Definitely work with the French Quarter residents to make sure that something that they can tolerate and have in their front door. Ms. Charleston?
My name is Maddie Charleston. I think as a resident, we all are willing and want this to happen. I just also want to keep in mind, the man you saw in a wheelchair today was my husband. I'm sure you all can imagine it's very difficult to live in the corridor with a wheelchair with ongoing construction and enforcement issues. So we just want to keep that in mind with that amount of permits and where those are at. Because for my from what I understand, we don't really know where Lucky Dogs is technically allowed and where they're not allowed. So maybe having a better understanding of where that map is and just making sure that enforcement with ramps, if the city does not have a ramp closed off, that they're not blocked, just kind of common sense things, which I think everyone would agree would be fair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Charles. Councilmember Green.
From a historic perspective, I'd like to just note, and maybe our Councilmember Morrell, while he's doing that research, can determine this. But during the Morial administration, there was actually a lottery for push carts because there was concern that there was a monopoly in the French Quarter by French Quarter Ice Cream and also by Lucky Dogs. And there were some permits issued and some people actually went in business. For example, there was a vendor who had a push cart who sold gifts, for example, across from Harrah's. There was one down at the corner of Poydras and St. Charles. There were licenses issued, but by and by, because it takes so much to run a cart, those vendors did not continue. There was a requirement, for example, that your cart had to be stored somewhere that was nearby, but then that was a difficulty in getting spaces. So over time, those licenses went away. And actually the operators of the licenses went away and then the licenses expired because there was a time period during which you had to do business. So as research is being done, it might be looked back in the 1990s to see what was done to with that lottery and what happened since then. I would like to kind of just state one other thing, and it's a challenge. But for those who have carts and whoever puts in place the regulations, we always have to be sensitive to the fact that there are people who have insurance requirements, who pay utilities, who have on-site labor, who pay for maintenance of their facilities, and they have to be respected too. We have businesses that have been in business for a while, for example, on Claiborne Avenue selling products, and then someone puts a cart in front of it for special occasions and sells the exact same product that they're selling. We have to be fair and recognize that we present opportunities for those who want to do more business, but we should not be in the business of restricting opportunities for those who have invested significantly in their facilities. I didn't mention taxes. So we have taxes, maintenance, we have utilities, we have the things that go into a building, insurance, especially these days. So as we move forward, let's just be cognizant of the fact that we want to create opportunities for small business owners, but we sometimes even hurt small business owners by not regulating and not paying attention to where and not being sensitive to where some of the carts are set up. I see food carts set up sometimes in front of restaurants. That's just not fair. No matter what the rule is, and it's not a rule that the city would create, it's just not fair. I see alcoholic beverages being sold on the backs of trucks in front of Kermit's on Claiborne Avenue. It's not fair. So at the end of the day, we just want to keep all of that in mind. I don't really have a conclusion other than we need to be fair to those who are business owners and entrepreneurs who want to do something, but keeping in mind, we also need to be fair to those who have invested because their families deserve a good rate of return. Their families deserve to have something done to support them too. And I think in some areas, we need to look at the effect that it's having on businesses that were in locations and why they aren't there now. For example, if on a Sunday, you're going to lose your biggest revenue day because you have carts and trucks in front of your business, why would you stay in business on Claiborne Avenue, for example? But we'll talk about that more, but just keep in mind the need to be fair as we have these conversations. Opportunities are important for all. So.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. Mr. Kazan, you had a comment? Mr. Kazan, you had a comment? I'm just messing with you. I know y'all the next meeting. All right, no further comments at this time. This time, make a motion to adjourn.
Second. Oh, I'm not on the committee.
Second by Councilman Moreno, motion to adjourn. Thank you.
All right.